Really excited to be here. I am the CEO and co-founder of Bastion Zero. We are an infrastructure cybersecurity startup based in Boston, so I came out here from Boston. Really fun to be with the DevOps community, learn a lot from you guys. My background is in InfoSec, but I work a lot with DevOps folks. Okay, so just a quick, who am I? Started out as an engineer. I was working in telecom, got my PhD, got interested in cryptography, became a researcher and professor at Boston University, where I still work. I teach InfoSec there, and I have for the last 13, 14 years. For most of my research in the lab that I was running, we did a lot of work on internet protocols, so BGP, DNS, NTP. My small claim to fame in this community is, do you remember in 2015 when you had to update all your NTP daemons? Does anyone remember that? It's okay, at least one person. So that our lab was the lab that started that research line. So I did a bunch of that stuff, got into blockchain research, started a blockchain startup. That's all I'm going to say about that right now. If you'd like to hear about that adventure, I'm here for a few more hours. I'd be happy to tell you about that. So now my company is called Bastion Zero, and what we do is we provide passwordless access to server, database, web, and Kubernetes infrastructure. So I am very online. Please connect to me. I'm all over social media. I'm on Mastodon if anyone else is using Mastodon. Used to be a big Twitter person, but not so much anymore. All right, so this is a picture of Jews and Christians debating their religions in 1483. Has anyone ever seen this picture before? Does anyone know who the Jews are? They have the pointy hats. I'm Jewish, so I find this funny. Okay, so there we are. We're having a religious debate, and they were debating Judaism versus Christianity, and this would very high stakes, and people would come watch this. And of course, you can't resolve this debate, because if you're Jewish, you're going to believe in Judaism. You're Christian, you're going to believe in Christianity. But we had these debates. And I feel like the debate between SaaS and self-hosting is sometimes very similar, in which you'll find people where they're so set in their viewpoint that there's nothing you can do to change their mind, whether one or the other. So before we get into, and that's what this talk is going to be about. So I'm going to try to put some structure around this debate. I'm very interested in this. I'm actually obsessed with this. Our product is a SaaS. We agonized over whether we should make it a SaaS or self-hosted. We went with SaaS. I think it was the right decision, but I still regularly encounter folks who are like, I will never use a SaaS, and it's just out of the question. So I just really, really care about this. So I want to try to make this interactive. I'm also a professor. I do a lot of lecturing. So how many people are in the camp of SaaS where it's just like, that's it, I'm only going to do SaaS? Can I see hands? How many in that it's only going to be self-hosting? We've only got one. So everybody else is fluid. Everybody else is willing to make a call based on the circumstance. So how many people are willing to make a call based on the circumstance? Oh, wow, that's fascinating. Huh, OK, that's very interesting. So I wasn't expecting that. OK. Well, so maybe it's not as religious as I thought. So maybe what we'll do is this is the first time I'm giving this talk and I'm taking this out of my own head. So it's very interesting. So maybe what we'll do is we'll just walk through some of the components that I think are very relevant to making these kinds of decisions. And I'll spend a little bit extra time on security because that's where my home is and that's where I'm most interested. And this is kind of like a collection of anecdotes that I've been amassing in my head for the last 3 years and kind of the first time I'm putting them together here. So the religious debate goes something like this. Self-hosted systems provide better availability within my trust boundaries. Everything is under my control, and that means it's going to be better for compliance and security. Is this resonating for people? Right? That is the typical argument that I see. I control it. It's under my control. That means it's going to be better for security because it's within my trust boundary, and it's not outside. I don't know what's happening with it. The other view is that I just don't have time to operate this service. So for people who are in the SaaS camp, how much of it is based on, I just don't have time for this crap, I can't run this myself? So that's the majority view. Okay, so one of the things I want to talk about is I agree, that is the majority view. I think the one place where people won't debate is running it yourself is more work than not running it yourself. So I think we kind of all agree about that, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. But I think that the whole decision-making process is actually more complicated than just like, I'm too busy to run this, I don't have the expertise, versus I do have the expertise, and so I want to run it. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, why I care so much about this, I've lost business because of this question. So I have a customer quote from here from someone who loves self-hosted. We were trying to sell our product to them, and they said we're going to go with some other solution. The resources are critical to the business, and without an on-prem solution, we'd be at your mercy if there are issues with the service, so they didn't go with our product. And then there are other teams that I've talked to where they said, there's no way I want to run the solution myself, so this is the typical, like, it's too much work to run this on my own. But there's actually more, right? So sometimes when people choose a SaaS, and I just wanted to kind of bring that up in some of these quotes, I have a lot of accounts, and I don't want to have a version of your product in each one of my accounts or figure out a way to network them together. I'd rather have just a SaaS that connects to all the accounts, and I've got one place to manage things, right? Another thing is that if I try to run things myself, it breaks, and I don't know how to fix it or react fast enough. And actually, this particular position is very interesting because it also has implications on security, as I'll show you in some of the incidents, including like a ransomware incident that I'm going to show you. OK, so that's what we're going to look at. All right. So what are the angles that we're going to talk about? Reliability, availability, operational overhead and cost. I feel like number 3 is the least, maybe the least debated one, because it either is going to cost you more or cost you less to run it yourself. The complexity of your environment, what you require from compliance and what you require from security. And this gets even more interesting if you're dealing with something like GDPR, where you may have data residency requirements. So how many people here are familiar with data residency requirements in their service? Wow, OK, great. So all of this stuff will sometimes implicate what you choose in these solutions. Another question, how many people for data residency requirements have forced you to self-host? Has that been the reason that's forced you to self-host? No. OK. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to finish my talk fast, and then I just like to hear some opinions from the room, because I think this is just a really interesting question. OK. So on the reliability side, I always felt like, and maybe I'm wrong, but I always felt like the conventional wisdom says that self-hosting a solution is going to give you better reliability. And why is that? Yes? So people feel that that's the case. That's what I feel is the conventional wisdom that I'm getting from customers when we're out there trying to sell our product. I control this solution. I can fix it myself. I'm not going to rely on the vendor. The vendor may be too slow. Right? And I don't want to have to worry about US East 1 going down when I'm in GCP, and therefore the service goes down, right? And so I think this is, at least to me, what the conventional wisdom is. But on the other hand, when you're looking at these things, I found this was really interesting. This is from JFrog. JFrog has, I don't know if you can see it, but I can read it to you. JFrog has both a cloud version and a self-hosted version. And what's interesting is in the reliability metric, in the SaaS, they give you a 99.9% SLA. And then in the self-hosted, there is no SLA, right? Because the SLA is your problem, right? So it's actually interesting to think that maybe in a SaaS, you may actually potentially get better reliability if the SLA is actually being honored. Maybe it's not being honored. You can look at the SLA. SLAs can be sneaky. Sometimes they're written in such a way that if they go down, all the vendor loses is 5% of the bill that month. So it's whatever, I'll lose 5% of the bill that month. So this is very tricky, but I think it's very interesting that at least you can see a commitment to reliability in the SaaS situation, which in the self-hosted situation you really just can't see. OK. Yeah. So I wanted to show this video, but I'm going to go forward. You know what? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and show it. So I wanted to show this video because this is the head of trust at Atlassian, and he says this better than me, actually. I found this was really interesting.
And there's, I think, a common, almost dialectic, right? An expectation that somehow the move to cloud is risky. And one thing that gets lost sometimes is the realization that from a security standpoint, from a reliability standpoint, from a trust standpoint, the fact that all customers are running in one environment actually affords the type of scalability around trust that isn't possible in an on-premise deployment, right? We can build incident response processes at the microservices layer, right? We can build out an environment where we're doing testing at a microservices layer, where we can test every piece of data, where we can do trials for deployment of a patch in a small area in a way that simply isn't possible with software being delivered on-premise, whether it be data center or server architecture. And so over the long run, it's absolutely the case that the cloud architecture is one that's going to afford us to be able to deliver levels of scalability, reliability, performance that simply isn't possible ever in a data center environment. So that's one of the reasons that we're so excited about the opportunity to improve the overall capability that you're going to have from a trust standpoint in a way that just isn't possible without migrating to cloud.
So he's much more eloquent than I am. I thought that was really interesting because what I've encountered, and I know that a lot of people in this room are SREs and DevOps, and I know that you know that if you're running your own service, you're going to feel better about its reliability than if you were selling the software to your customer to run in their environment. And then you have to worry about what happens when you screwed up and the update that you pushed maybe didn't do the right thing, and they're going to have to be the one to fix it, and you're going to have to be the one to explain to them that they have to fix it, right? So I think that it's very interesting to me because reflexively I've really heard the story that reliability is better with self-hosting because I control it, but maybe that's not true. So I just wanted to challenge that here. Another thing about availability is actually that your ability to actually make sure the service is available can sometimes be limited by the vendor's ability to actually push the patches to you. So because Twitter no longer really works anymore, this thread was deleted. But did anyone see this thread from Kevin Beaumont where he was trying to patch Microsoft Exchange servers and it took him 2 days to do it? Did anyone see this? So he was live tweeting his patching of Microsoft Exchange servers. And it just took him so long because the patches didn't quite work and his environment was a particular way and he had a particular operating system and all of this stuff. So it is something just to keep in mind that I think the first order concern is I control this, and that's true, right? I control this. But the second order concern is you control this, but you have to make sure it's running. Can you actually really do that, right? So availability actually is affected potentially by the fact that you are needing to expend operational overhead in running the service. Okay, so this is the part that I think I don't need to talk about. Operational overhead, managing the system myself is more work, has longer time to value and maintenance costs. On the other hand, if you don't have time to manage the system, let the vendor do the work. We may have to pay a little bit more. We may pay a little bit less, depending on the solution, but we at least don't have to do the work. So I think this part is less twisty when we think about it. Okay. On complexity of the environment, I thought that this is just a nice picture to think about. When we have a SaaS, the SaaS can be talking across all the environments. Hopefully it's a cloud agnostic SaaS, which most SaaSes are. It's a data center agnostic SaaS. You can run one version of this. On the other hand, if you're actually in a hybrid environment, and this doesn't have to be you're in 3 different clouds or a hybrid cloud situation. This can just be you have 18,000 AWS accounts. And I know there's at least one company out there that has that I've talked to them. So then they would need to potentially have a deployment of this thing in 18,000 AWS accounts, right? Which is really, really painful. So trying to simplify complexity, actually, maybe the SaaS is really your only option, depending on the complexity of the environment. Okay, on the compliance side, this is another really interesting one. So this is a perfectly valid opinion. Data cannot leave my perimeter, right? This is a perfectly valid opinion. You may be subject to data residency requirements. You may be just there is no way this data is leaving my perimeter. I work with power companies, and there's no way I'm going to explain to them that their data has left my perimeter, right? There's just no way that that's going to fly. And I respect that as an opinion. I think that's really fair. There are people who really just don't care, and that's also fine. And that's a perfectly fine position. I don't know where you find yourself in the spectrum. I think it's a threat modeling question, going back to our previous speaker. What are you worried about here? But then there's also actually a question of data at rest versus data in flight that I wanted to dig into a little bit. So data in flight means that the data is transitioning through the SaaS, and maybe the SaaS vendor can see it, but they're not storing it. So maybe they're seeing it, they're running some kind of analytics on it, but then the actual data at rest is not visible to the vendor. And that's actually something that you can do in a SaaS. And so I wanted to show you a couple of models that are out there in a lot of different products that a little bit challenge whether data cannot leave my perimeter applies to your particular situation. I will say that if you are absolutely unwilling to accept data in flight leaving your perimeter, then you may have a problem with the SaaS. If you're OK with data in flight but not OK with data at rest, right? Data at rest is just data that's sitting there, stored. And data in flight is it's passing on the wire, but then it gets deleted afterwards, right? So a couple of ways that I've seen people do things. This is very typical, where you have the SaaS, and the data is just, as soon as the SaaS collects the data, it immediately dumps it into your environment. So they're not holding the data for you, right? And so they're not storing anything. You don't have to explain to anyone that data is being stored somewhere, and you don't have to worry about the data being breached because the SaaS was breached or something like that. Another approach actually is very interesting. It uses asymmetric cryptography. And the idea is that the way that encryption works with asymmetric cryptography is that you can have the key that does the decryption is the secret key, and then the key that does the encryption is the public key. So encrypt with the public key, decrypt with the private key. So what you do is you give the public key to the vendor encrypts the data for you under the public key, stores it for you, and only you have the secret key. So they're still storing the data for you, but they're not able to access it without your permission, without you giving them the decryption key. So they can't actually decrypt it unless you are involved. Right? So this is a way of limiting some of the risk associated with data storage. And we've seen both of those. We're building out the first one into our product right now. I've seen the second one in a lot of places. Like, for example, Snowflake has this. So you can find this in a lot of different products. So I just encourage you to look for this if you are having a data compliance issue when you're thinking about this question. OK, now we get to my favorite part. And I can go on for hours here, but I won't. So how much time do I have? OK, good. So I have some time. So security. There's so many pieces to this, at least in my own head, because this is what I spend all my time thinking about, which is, OK, the first one, a SaaS. I cannot trust a SaaS. No SaaS gets to hold my secrets. I am not using a SaaS. This is way too sensitive information. If they get breached, I'm screwed. End of story. I'm not doing it, right? So you do find this in some situations where you have an air-gapped network. They'll run their own identity provider. They'll run their own IDP. They'll run their own SIEM that they're self-hosting. You do find this. And I feel like people are sort of when they think of the security question, they're really saying, you know what, I'll use a SaaS. I'll give up on the fact that I have some risk associated with the SaaS, but I'm still going to use the SaaS anyway because of all the other benefits, right? But there's another piece here. What's the counter argument that a SaaS is more secure than a self-hosted system? Any ideas on the counter argument here? Reputation? Yeah, so you have incentive not to get hacked if you're a SaaS because it's going to be really embarrassing and you're going to lose business. That's actually not the one that I had, but that's a fair point. What else is, yeah? It's their core business. So again, we're going to the reputational thing, right? So we believe the SaaS is going to protect our data because it's their job to protect our data. They're going to do a better job than us. And I think that's a fair argument. I have one more. Any more arguments here? More expertise. Yeah, so we're coming back to the same, we trust the SaaS more than we trust ourselves. But I want to put a very specific component on it, patching, OK? Patching. So I think patching plays a huge role in the security argument. And it's very interesting to me that nobody came up with this when I asked you this, because this to me looms very large in my head, patching, right? So patching is really hard and annoying. And sometimes it's hard to do it yourself. And so what I wanted to just walk through was a few different security incidents that to me were emblematic of this debate and what we can learn from them. So the first one. How many people remember January 4th of this year? CircleCI breached. So I see some nodding heads. People remember getting up. It was 10 p.m. in Boston when I saw the notice. I don't know here. It was probably 8 p.m., so maybe it was less bad. But there was a breach notification, and I've never seen one like this that said, thank you for your urgent attention to rotating your secrets. So basically, any secrets that you had in the CircleCI SaaS had to be rotated immediately. And I was our Slacks lit up. I mean, we don't use CircleCI, but I'm on 100 different Slacks, and I was watching everybody up and complaining and asking, do I have to rotate this kind of secret and that kind of secret? And the answer was every single secret in CircleCI had to be rotated. And the reason that this happened was because the way that CircleCI works is that when you would give credentials to the SaaS, that SaaS would spin up a runner. That runner would have the credentials, and those credentials would allow it to actually do the builds and do the deploys. Right? And so the SaaS actually needed to hold the credentials in order to do the deploys, because deploy means push to production. So production credentials were actually being given to CircleCI, and CircleCI was breached. Right? So this was maybe the most classic example I can think of I definitely don't want to trust a third-party service with my secrets. Right? This is to me pretty canonical. Okay. Questions and thoughts. Okay, so I gave another talk a couple weeks ago about the answer to this problem, by the way, isn't just go to self-hosted, right? because I know we have one of the developers of Jenkins in the room right now, but this is my slide about Jenkins. What if you used a self-hosted CI/CD pipeline? Well, Jenkins needs a lot of love in order to be secure, and there have been a lot of different breaches of Jenkins, and why are people breaching Jenkins? Well, isn't it a great place to breach? If you want to pop the entire network, why don't you go to the thing that pushes all the deploys to the entire network, right? So the security of CI/CD is a really big deal. Security of Jenkins is a really big deal. And Jenkins is constantly getting studied from a security perspective, and there are constantly vulnerabilities. There's 1,400 CVEs in the vulnerability database on Jenkins. So if you're running Jenkins locally, you really need to love and care the system, and if you're not patching it fast enough, you've created a security risk for yourself. So it is not true to say that just going off of Circle CI and running a self-hosted system is going to make your life better, right? Because you have this patching. And on the patching side, right, I wasn't able to find very up-to-date metrics, but there was a report in 2015 that most vulnerabilities take around 100 days to patch. So once you run through your patching cycles in your organization, until you get through the patching, there may be a big lag. And at least in 2015, the lag between when you patch and when adversaries realize there's an exploitable vulnerability, actually, the adversaries are faster than the patchers. That's what has been found, at least in 2015. And I don't know if in your organization you measure mean time to patch, but this is a big issue, right? So patching on the security side is very important. This is another interesting thing that I found. So Tenable released a list in 2022 of all the patches that had been the maximally sort of exploited in 2022. Log4Shell, so everyone remembers Log4Shell, right? Does anyone not remember Log4Shell? Did anyone not get woken up by Log4Shell? So basically, everyone here was affected by Log4Shell. That was December, okay? But in 2022, it was still the most exploitable vuln out there, #1 on the list, right? And that's because it takes a long time to patch things, especially when they're deep inside systems like Log4Shell was. There's another couple of vulnerabilities in here. You can see this one, Proxy Shell. I think it's a Microsoft Exchange vulnerability, and it was a year, like 2021 summer that this one came out, and it was still being exploited in 2022. Equifax was breached in 2017. Everyone remembers that probably, and that was due to a vulnerability in Apache that had been, the patch was out, and they hadn't patched, right? So patching is actually a huge thing, right? And so kind of like taking all of our crowdsourced answers here about like the vendor can do a better job than me, really I think comes down to this, right? Is that how quickly can you react to their, react to the patches that are already given to you as the DevOps team that's running the software. Okay, this is a crazy one. This is the REvil ransomware, the Kaseya ransomware. Do people remember this incident? It was 2021. Okay, so Kaseya is a software platform for MSPs, for managed service providers. They tend to help MSPs that are like working with small businesses like restaurants, dental offices, like a sort of more or less techie businesses. The MSPs will purchase the Kaseya software, and they will use that to manage machines at their customers who are probably very non-technical. So these are basically outsourced IT departments. Okay, so here's the story. On April 1st, the Dutch, I forget, DIVD, the Dutch Vulnerability Disclosure Agency, in the Netherlands, they found 7 vulnerabilities in Kaseya. And they gave them, so you know how these things go, there's usually a responsible disclosure window. So there was a 90-day disclosure window on the vulnerabilities that these researchers found, and then they were going to expose the existence of the vulnerabilities along with the patch. Okay, now I believe it was so Kaseya had managed to patch 3 out of the 7 vulnerabilities. This guy, Victor Gevers, he was the actual guy who did the disclosure, and if you look at the interviews with him, he was talking about how Kaseya was making an honest effort to actually put the patches together and get them out to the software. I should mention that the way that Kaseya worked was that a lot of their managed service providers were self-hosting the Kaseya software that was being used to access their customers' environments, like these dentist offices and restaurants, right? So they were working on their patches, and what happened was the adversary, REvil, was able to actually build an exploit that was completed before Kaseya completed the patching. So basically, their patching was too slow. Okay. So what happened? They hadn't completed all the patching. They hadn't released this to the MSPs. They started to get attacked, and so what they did was they shut down their service, just completely shut it off. Completely shut it off. They were able to shut off the cloud service immediately. And so all their cloud customers were unaffected, even though they hadn't patched, right? They just turned off the service. They were like, this is too dangerous, we're just gonna go offline. So they went offline. And they were able to actually protect all the customers that were on the cloud service. But the self-hosted service, they didn't even have a patch for them. And so there was this scramble to kind of like get all these self-hosted people to turn off their services. So it's like a really crazy story of like being exploited in between the disclosure and patching window, right? And at least in the cloud case, they were able to just turn off the service altogether. When I saw this, I was like, wow, that's really unusual. And this was one of the worst ransomware attacks at that point that had been seen. Okay. Kind of going back to just like less of sort of craziness, like what we saw with Kaseya. Another sort of canonical example that I have that I wanted to walk through, Okta was breached at the start of last year. Lots of people saw this. This was a very big deal, right? Because Okta is the identity provider for a lot of companies, and Okta is basically providing single sign-on, right? So when I log into my employee whatever, I'm gold B at Bastion 0, and so Okta controls that. And so Okta was breached, and everybody freaked out, but actually it was really interesting. Okta has actually pretty good security practices, so they were able to segment the damage, and it wasn't as bad as everybody thought. But of course, Okta getting breached scares the crap out of everyone. You don't want to be reporting to your CTO that Okta got breached and we were using Okta. Like, that's not going to be a fun conversation to have, right? Is the answer to go to something that's self-hosted? So I wanted to kind of go back to our friend over here who's like, it's more secure if I run it myself. Sort of the classic example of like a self-hosted system is again for identity providers. This is ADFS, which is used to provide like administrative access to servers, and it's self-hosted in a lot of big companies and enterprises. And so you'd think, self-hosting your identity provider is probably a good thing because you're not at the mercy of like the third-party service getting breached, like what happened with Okta. But actually, ADFS, because it's so valuable and so complicated, there's an entire tradecraft around hacking into ADFS. And in fact, if you can take a course on it in May on 3-day advanced ADFS exploitation techniques. And this is known to be, the Russian hackers use this a lot in their ransomware. So you can see this in a lot of the like things you'll read about in the newspaper, like Colonial Pipeline, I don't think of SolarWinds, but you'll see a lot of these bigger high-profile attacks. They're actually attacking ADFS, and the reason they do that is because they can get admin on all your servers when they do that, which is a nice thing to be able to do if you're an adversary, right? So, I've shown you both sides of this debate, and I kind of wanted to just like where we landed with this in my company and the way I think about this. As I mentioned, my background is in cryptography. I don't think the question of security comes down to self-host versus not self-host, actually, at least on the security side. Because on the security side, you have, okay, like a third party outsourcing my secrets, what if they get hacked? Very legitimate concern, because they do actually get hacked, right? Or, self-host it, what if I can't deploy the patches on time? Also very legitimate concern. I think the problem is with a lot of these systems is that they're so valuable that they're just a magnet for attackers. Something like ADFS that has admin on everything you own is a magnet for attackers, and so it's a risk whether you self-host it, whether you third-party host it, right? I actually have, and this is the debate again, I actually have an answer to this, and this is really what we did with our service, where what we did was we made sure that our cloud service actually does not have a privileged access or administrative access to our customers' environments. What we do is we actually use the identity provider as a second root of trust. And so in order to actually use, I shouldn't say what our product does. Our product provides access to servers, databases, clusters, and things like that for engineers and for CI/CD processes. But what we did was we made sure that our cloud service didn't actually have secrets, doesn't actually have privilege. And so if it gets breached, it's not going to impact your infrastructure. They would also have to breach your identity provider, which could be Okta, could be OneLogin, could be AzureAD, could be Google, all of these different identity providers, whatever you end up using. And that way you don't have this very, very attractive point of compromise, but still get to have a SaaS that you don't have to patch and do all these things with. So, and this is like my personal thing with the background in cryptography that I have, and this is what I've really been working on in different contexts for the last 10 years before starting Bastion Zero. So I hope that this made it a little bit more granular when you're thinking about these decisions, right? And so, there are a lot of different axes in which you can judge this. I think reliability and availability is a very big gray area when you're thinking about SaaS versus self-hosted. I think compliance is maybe less of a gray area, and I think security is also a huge gray area, actually, when you're thinking about SaaS versus self-hosted. Again, I do think that teams will just have their own positions on this, and I've had conversations where someone will just stand there and explain to me why self-hosting is the only way you can do things, and I'm just nodding, because this person is not going to listen to anything I have to say. And same with the other side, right? But I think that there are lots of different pieces to consider here beyond just the obvious, I don't have to host it, so I have to do less work, versus I do host it, and so it's going to be more secure and available, right? It's a lot more complicated than that. And that is it. So I'm happy to take any questions on that. Thanks.
All right. I'm sure there's some questions out there.
Who is your IDP?
Ours? We use Google right now because we're small. Well, our product supports 4 IDPs, soon to be 5. So.
There you go. All right. Sounds great. And obviously, come grab anybody and do an open space if you're more interested in all of this kind of stuff. It is always a very good topic of whether you host stuff yourself or not. Oh, one more question.
Sorry, guys, I have a lot of questions. In our company, we do it based on trust zones. So when we're talking closer to source code, we take more privilege on self-host. We move a little bit behind here. We would take a lot more precautions to self-host and everything. When we're talking about customer data, everything's self-hosted. But for things like metrics and things like that are not not privileged data, we have actually a cloud vendor do a lot of these things too. So how do you feel about the mixed environment where you have some things self-hosted and some things cloud-hosted? Is that something you've seen with your software?
Yeah, I mean, we do see that there's a mix, and people will self-host certain things and cloud-host other things. But again, I heard you say we host it ourselves, so it's more secure. And I guess that's a little bit what I'm trying to challenge here, where we've seen it may be more secure if the patching cadence is not very high, and the vendor is able to react fast enough to patches. Do you know what I mean? So there's more to it than just I host it myself and therefore it's more secure. And I think that's what I was trying to bring out. And every time one of these things happens, then I'm again, adding it to my laundry list in my head that you saw part of it in this presentation. So. Yeah.
Hi. So probably a weird question. So in a field of security, what's more profitable, being a good guy or a bad guy?
I think being a bad guy for sure. But then I've got my ethics that keep me on the right path. I used to be a cybersecurity researcher in a university, which is the least lucrative way of doing this. So now I'm the CEO of a startup, which I don't know, it hasn't become so lucrative for me yet. But if you guys buy my product, then maybe it will be. Yeah, but you know what I do teach? I do teach undergrads, and I tell them about white hat, black hat, and gray hat. And I actually tell them that I'm expecting them to not become black hats or gray hats out of respect for me, teaching them all this stuff. So I don't know to the extent to which that's true, but that is something I tell them.
All right, awesome. We'll give it up for Sharon one more time. Thank you so much.